Good evening. Glad you could join us in person or virtually. As always, we're going to start with prayer. So we're going to, just a few reminders. First of all, Derek and Lucy, they're traveling right now. So they're flying over to Oregon. It's like a whole other country. So they're headed out there. So pray for their travels. They'll be out there for about a week. Keep praying for Jim Leipold, just with his health needs. Doctors did some tests, so hopefully they'll figure out what the issues are, help him out. Also be with Corey. Corey's health issues. Just keep praying for that. And maybe traveling next week. Yeah. So down to Alabama. So pray for that. And then, of course, Brad. Be praying for Brad as he has his procedure a week from Friday is when that's planned. So be praying for that. So many things to be praying for. Keep praying for one another. And as always, if you have something you're watching online and want to add something to the prayer list, just put a comment on there or send us an email or something. We're happy to add those to the list. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, we just thank you that we can come together tonight, both to hear your word and also spend this time in prayer and singing. Just pray the Lord's blessing upon all who participate. Do think of Jim Leipold. Just watch over him and his health. Be with the doctors as they try to find out how they can help him. And just pray, Lord, he gets stronger. We also pray for Corey. Watch over him and his health needs, but also his upcoming travels, that all will go well there. We also pray for Brad, with the procedure coming up a week from Friday, that all will go well, and that it'll help him just feel better and get off some of the medications. We have Lisa, too, as she cares for him, as well as for Anna and others. And pray also for Derek and Lucy. Just watch over their travels as they're traveling even now. Have a safe trip, an enjoyable trip, relaxing trip, and be able to come back next week safe and sound. Just watch over us tonight. Be with Matthew as he brings your word, and all of us as we hear it, that we be encouraged and also challenged by it. Praise in Jesus' name. Amen. Corey, we're going to sing Faith is the Victory. All right. Glorious victory. There you go.
Or it comes a little later.
Anybody have any verse preferences here? We'll sing 3 out of the 4, but
No.
let's do 1, 2, and 3. How about that? All right, 1, 2, and 3 of Faith is the Victory, number 171. Encamped along the hills of light, ye Christian soldiers rise, and press the battle ere the night shall veil the glowing skies. Against the foe in vales below, let all our strength be heard. It is the victory we know that overcomes the world. Faith is the victory, faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world. His banner over us is love, our sword, the word of God. We tread the road, the saints above, with shouts of triumph trod. By faith they like a whirlwind's breath swept on o'er every field. The faith by which they conquered death is still our shining shield. Faith is the victory, faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world. On every hand the foe we find drawn up in dread array. Let tents of ease be left behind and onward to the fray. Salvation's helmet on each head, the truth all gird about. The earth shall tremble neath our tread and echo with our shout. Faith is the victory, faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world. Great job.
up with 2 minutes of thanks. If anyone has anything they want to be specifically thankful for, and I will say that, so I've been doing this job, this comic and card shop and all, and I can be thankful that I am starting to catch on to some of the geeky stuff I was unaware of before, or didn't realize as much about. I'm starting to learn, I'm starting to get it down. I feel a little bit better about that.
Okay.
So I was able today in conversation to use a buzzword industry term that 2 weeks ago I went, what is that? And today I was like, haha, this thing. And the guy I was talking to went, what is that?
Ah.
And I said, it's this. So, yes, I'm thankful for that. So I'm getting there. It's all sorts of in and outs. Man, there's so many baseball collecting terms. So much. So much.
Baseball doesn't have a lot of terms, so.
Baseball doesn't have a lot of terms. The cards. Good. Nice.
Inside baseball, so to speak.
That's right. Literally so. People are on one. So, and then I've been talking to Joe about Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh cards too. So Joe's been
Oh, well, Joe will help you out there.
talking to Joe on Sundays
Oh, yeah.
about that. Yeah.
He's an encyclopedia of knowledge on
He
all
is.
of those things.
He is.
So.
Good. I like it. So, any other thanks for anything?
Well, I'm thinking that Derek and Lucy aren't here.
I'm thankful Derek and Lucy aren't here.
No, I mean, that was something they would say. But
Yeah.
I'm thankful they get a week off and you can go see family and stuff. So that's a good break for him and both of them. She's in between classes, and so that's good. She got done with all of her papers and stuff. So that's one from them.
Yeah, definitely so. Good break for him.
I'm thankful we had all those kids there last night. Nice to see all the tables full. So nobody's sick yet. Like
They
that,
did a good
so
job too.
Yeah, that's really good.
That was really nice. See them all.
Did pretty well. They took our class in and told the little kids, had them tell the little kids the Bible story and draw it out and tell them.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, they did that pretty well. So we'll tell them to the next class up next week. But anything else to close out? We'll get on with where we're going tonight, which is 1 Samuel 17. One of the most familiar stories in all the Bible. So familiar that even if you know next to nothing about the Bible or the stories, the people in it, probably at least heard of this one. People will throw this one out as a very famous story of David's and Goliath. So, we'll give it an official title up here. Nice and simple. And there's one moment in particular of this story that always sticks out to me, always stands out in my head, and I think a lot about, and it leads me back to it again from time to time. And I was also just trying to think a few weeks ago, as Derek and I were talking about what we were going to do on Wednesday nights, of just stories in the Bible where people just intersect from all over the place. You get people with different backgrounds, and people just intersect in one spot and in one time. And you get a lot of those with Jesus and the Pharisees and people from outside Jerusalem and Israel, all from different backgrounds coming together in one spot. Sunday, we just talked about one with the disciples and Pentecost and people from all over the world in one spot. And lives changed forever in that case. And here, we get the same thing. So if you want to put it in kind of movie dramatic terms, you get the idea, at least the way I'm going to come at it, you get the idea of 4 people entering, 3 people leaving, and everybody's lives being changed forever because of what happens. So the 4 people that we're going to focus on as we look at this are, of course, these 2. We'll add Saul onto that mix. We'll also bring up Eliab, David's oldest brother. So, aside from Jesse, David's father in the story, this is just about everybody that gets a speaking part. And so for Goliath, we'll also add in just the entire Philistines in a block. So let's look at verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle and were gathered together at Shoko, which belonged to Judah, and pitched between Shoko and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. All right, so we'll give mountainous areas here. Israel. No. Give us valley in between.
I'm sorry, Matthew, what chapter are you in?
Oh, sorry, 1 Samuel 17.
17.
Yep.
I had it right.
Yep. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 4. So you get the Philistines on one side, Israelites on the other, valley in between. Verse 4, and there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And it will vary depending on the versions you're reading. Most people go with this, and they say he was somewhere around 9'9". The Septuagint, so the Greek translation of all this, has him at 4 cubits, Josephus and all that stuff, but most people settle around the 9'9". But you'll get all the way from just a guy like 6'8" to 11 feet and all that. But again, mostly hovers around 9'9". Either way, tall dude, especially for the times. So this champion named Goliath comes out. Verse 5, and he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders, and the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. So, a big boy. And you'll get, again, same thing here. You'll get all sorts of different estimates on how much his armor weighed. It was 100 and some pounds. Even this iron head of this spear, probably 15 pounds, most likely.
A bowling ball.
Bowling
Heavy
ball,
bowling
yeah.
ball.
Yeah, heavy bowling ball, lobbing the thing around. Yeah, it's a good way to think about it. Yep, exactly.
That's hard to imagine.
Imagine going into battle with that, maneuvering it, and all this stuff. And actually, that's one note I read about Goliath is, yeah, big guy and could carry all this weight, but still, he probably couldn't move very fast anyways with all he was carrying. And because of stuff like that, even if you're very strong, it's still going to take you an extra second to move that staff around. Verse 8. So he's got that, he's got the shield bearer. Verse 8. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel and said unto them, why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. And one translation of that word champion for Goliath is this idea of the man in the middle. So a guy who's going to come out between the two sides. So he issues a challenge saying, send somebody out, let's fight. Verse 9, if he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. All right? So that's how our story is introduced. We get this massive giant, 5 feet tall, big dude, coming out. We'll actually give him a bowling ball at the end of the spear. So he comes out, he's very mad. Every day he's shouting out to Israel a challenge. Come out and fight me, and if you kill me, the Philistines will be your servants, and if I kill you, you get to serve us, which Israel was kind of used to anyways in that case. So Goliath issues this challenge, and Israel responds, we see here, by being terrified, including Saul, including their king. So scared and dismayed, so downhearted and discouraged, along with their fear and with their worry. And before we get too much into the story, let me explain how I want to set it up tonight, which is, and take away our names.
You can turn over this off.
Okay. Take that off. And take down this incredible drawing. Oh, highly detailed, to scale drawing of what happened. And I want to put up sort of our 4 players we mentioned. So we got with Saul. We've got Goliath. And I need to make up my mind. All right.
Capitals.
Capitals for a little letter. Let's go cap. Goliath. David. And Goliath. Little brother. And for Goliath again, put together. And with the Philistines. Alright, so, as previously stated, this is one of the most familiar stories to us, and it's often seen in quite stark, basic terms. So Saul is scared, Goliath's terrifying, David rushes in and saves the day. We all go home, David becomes king eventually. The way I want to approach it tonight is to take these people as each one of us is here, as flesh and blood, living people, and pull them out for just a minute from this famous story from being Bible characters, quote unquote, and think about a little of what was going on with their background, what was going on inside their head at this time when these people, again from all different backgrounds, collided in this one spot. And so I'm going to be throwing out some terms like maybe and possibly and all that kind of stuff as we think through this song. But let's start with Goliath and the Philistines. So, and this is also going to be audience participation as well. So if you're Goliath and you're the Philistines, let's throw out some stuff immediately, right here in this situation. What you think? What's going through your head? I will start off with one and say, you probably feel kind of good. And I'm going to explain my kind of in a minute here. You're probably feeling pretty confident. Fear's the big reaction so far. Goliath's a huge dude. You don't really know who's going to take him on. What else you think? You're the Philistines or Goliath? Goliath's very confident. What else?
A bit dismissive
Uh-huh.
of the Israelites.
Yeah. Yep. So just kind of brushing things aside, not really taking them like they should be taking them. And we'll see here from recent experience some of the things that the Philistines should have been taking into consideration. So confident, a little bit dismissive.
But it's hard to say because they could have also put them out there because they thought that was the only way they could win. I don't know. They just did take out the Amalekites. So,
Very true.
Which was no small task.
Very true. So we'll put confident on this guy for sure, and we'll put a question mark.
Maybe they got it in the back of their mind.
Yeah.
What if this does go bad?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was gonna say too, maybe like, I mean, it's gotta be entertaining for them to watch Goliath roast people day after day.
Right.
And he does gain in confidence as he goes along. It seems like the more they don't come out, the louder and more obnoxious he becomes. So,
Yeah.
you know, they do.
Yeah. Exactly. So he only grows more confident, and as this continues to drag on for I think less than only 40 days, yeah, the Philistines are probably feeling even more confident themselves and pretty good about this. Like no one's going to come up and fight this guy really. And if you're Israel, so lopping Saul and Eliab here, because David hasn't showed up yet. If you're Israel, Israel has just a tough time with giants. Like they're just scared to death of giants. Let's go back to number 17 real quick. Yeah, unless you kill it. Then you eat them for breakfast. Numbers chapter 13. There we go. So Numbers 13 in verse 30. So the 12 spies go into Canaan. They go check it out. And the kids' song, 10 were bad, 2 were good. Joshua and Caleb come out saying, let's do it. God's with us. Let's take them on. The other 10 come out and say, what what they say here. Verse 30, and Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and possess it, for we are all well able to overcome it. But the men that went up with him said, we will not be able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, the land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof, and all the people that we saw in it are men of a great stature. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. So they see these people that to them look like giants, and they're terrified of it. And even though they agree that the land is great, it's everything God said it was, but at this point, the size of what they see in front of them outweighs the God they can't see, even though he's proved himself repeatedly to them. Let's go over now to Joshua 11. So Israel has to march around quite a while in God's judgment. As the entire generation that was listened to these guys was killed off. But finally they go into the land. Joshua 11, verse 21. Let's do that. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts that they should come against Israel in battle, that he might destroy them utterly. They might have no fear. Skip to 21. And at that time came Joshua and cut off the Anakims from the mountains from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua destroyed them utterly with their cities. There was none of the Anakims left in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod there remained. And then, of course, Caleb goes in and takes them on directly. You have this Anakims, this kind of people of giants, fearful people to the Israelites, reduced to only a few places. One of them notably being Gath, where this champion comes from. And there enters our first maybe. Maybe part of the Anakims? Who knows? So it's been a while, but a lot of people think, yeah, he may have been from all those lines, since all the signs kind of point toward it here. So in their history, they've got a very famous encounter with giants, where they've backed off and backed down and faced God's wrath entirely. And they've also, for some of them here, have a pretty good victory over these as well. But still the giants went on, still they lingered on. When it comes to the Philistines, you have God even changing Israel's path out of Egypt so they don't go through the way of the Philistines, because they're already, even when Israel is just coming out of Egypt, a war-making people. And God says, I don't want them to be discouraged already if they're not up for this fight. I don't want it to throw them off. And Israel was very easily thrown off at that point. So God takes them a longer way, even at the beginning, just to avoid this path of the Philistines. And these guys, you've got them really coming into their own here around the 12th and 13th centuries. So it's possible they were part of what's sort of called the Sea peoples. And those were people that also saw Egypt and said, hey, let's take Egypt. It looks cool. And they went in and they fought against Ramses III. Ramses III defeated them. And it's possible these guys were part of that block. And the Philistines proper ended up settling again around the 12th, 13th century along the coastlines of that Palestine area. In fact, the word Palestine itself is actually from the Greek translation of Philistine. So that's where it comes from. So they encamped along a coastal area. Let's do that. We'll put Jerusalem way over this side. Again, all totally to scale. Gaza and Ashkelon and Ashdod are 3 of their 5 main cities. And all of them are along the coast. And you move further in, and you get a city called Ekron. And you get a city called Gath. So where Goliath hangs out at. And you get Jerusalem around here, and you get where Saul came from, kind of way up there. So the Philistines, for all their war-making purposes, don't exactly branch out too far this entire time. So they're pesky to the areas around them. They're certainly one of the major supervillains for Israel in the Bible. They keep invading Israel, taking territory in Israel, but it's not like they end up just taking massive swaths of land. And eventually they suffer the same fate as Israel. So both the Assyrians and the Babylonians come in and wipe them out. And so they've just, in the last couple hundred years here, really started excavating some of these places and finding out more about the Philistines. And just a couple of years ago, they dug up some Philistine skeletons, I think like 10, and they ran DNA tests on them and found that the DNA even traces back to European heritage. So they came from a ways to get here, angry the entire time, apparently. And I don't know if we'll read the verses later or not, but just in case. These are people that are also, get on the mental part here, just put facts about them. They're just advanced as a society. So their architecture is at a little higher level. Their weapons are where they have the clear superiority, so they've got iron down. They've got that superiority over Israel. So much so that they're so much in charge of Israel, basically, that they make sure that Israel doesn't have any iron weapons. And Israel has to come to them if they want basic blacksmithing done at that point. So the Philistines are well armed, they're well advanced, and they're persistent in all the times they take on Israel and all they do. Let's get a little background on some of the previous run-ins here leading up to this battle with Goliath that they've had. So back to 1 Samuel. Now let's go to chapter 4. 1 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 1. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out against the Philistines to battle, and pitched beside Ebenezer, and the Philistines pitched Nathan. And the Philistines put themselves in array against Israel. And when they joined battle, Israel was smitten before the Philistines. And they slew of the army in the field about 4,000 men. And when the people were come into the camp, the elders of Israel said, Wherefore hath the Lord smitten us today before the Philistines? Let us fetch the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of Shiloh unto us, that when it cometh unto us, it may save us out of the hand of our enemies. So the people sent to Shiloh that they might bring from thence the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth between the cherubims, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. And when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so the earth rang again. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, What meaneth the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews? And they understood that the ark of the Lord was come into the camp. And the Philistines were afraid, for they said, God is come into the camp. And they said, Woe unto us, for there hath not been such a thing heretofore. Woe unto us, who shall deliver us out of the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods that smote the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. So if we want to add something else to what the Philistines have going through their head, they've got a memory of what's happened with Israel before and what this God of Israel has done. So if indeed they were some of the ones that fought Egypt before, they might have even been more impressed by this, because they went up against Egypt and lost. Israel, in their eyes, came out the winner. And so they've got a memory and at least some kind of superstition here. And in this case, a valid superstition of what could possibly happen to them. Even then, they refer to it as, who are these gods that did these things? So taking it as they would think of it. But verse 9, Be strong and quit yourselves like men, O ye Philistines, and ye be not servants unto the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Quit yourselves like men and fight. And the Philistines fought, and Israel was smitten, and they fled every man into his tent, and there was a very great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 footmen. And the ark of God was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain. All right, so you've got a society with a memory, but, and I think this comes into case in our Goliath story, you've also got kind of a resolved and determined society. So they had been fighting already back and forth with Israel throughout the book of Judges, and Samson and all of those guys. And they knew, no matter what their fears, that they didn't want to be servants to Israel like like they had made Israel to them. So you can see a little bit of this, I think, in the Goliath story as well. They send out their champion, probably wanting to see what happened. But I think this is probably still very much in their minds, this idea that we're not going to be subject, even though that's the promise Goliath made, that we're not going to be subject to them. So Israel gets this great defeat because Israel was a mess and had it coming at this point to try to get them back to God. And Eli's, the priest's sons, are killed, the ark's taken, and Philistines don't have very long before they regret it. A little bit. So God sends a plague among the Philistines. And you'll get same thing as you do with so much the Philistines. You'll get people going, well, maybe it was this, and maybe it was that. Like, whatever it was not very cool. People think some kind of bleeding hemorrhoids were the deal. And there's other guesses as well on what they might have been. Whatever it was deadly, and it was extremely painful, and the Bible says the cries of the city go up, and I have no doubt that those were audible cries. Chapter 6 of 1 Samuel. Verse 1, and the ark of the Lord was in the country of the Philistines 7 months. And the Philistines called for the priests and the diviners, saying, what shall we do to the ark of the Lord? Tell us wherewith we shall send it to his place, how we get it out of here. And they said, if he send away the ark of the God of Israel, send it not empty, but in any wise return him a trespass offering. Then shall ye be healed, and it shall be known to you why his hand is not removed from you. Then said they, what shall be the trespass offering which we shall respond to him? They answered, 5 golden emerods and 5 golden mice, according to the number of the lords of the Philistines. For one plague was on you all and on your lords. So the lords of these 5 cities, and all these cities that have gone through this, including Gath. So Goliath's got at least the knowledge of this in his history. It's kind of interesting here too, like how much they're so into their own religions that they want to send it back, but they also acknowledge there has to be something with it, like some form of trespass offering, which isn't even something you get from Israel. With the way Israel acts, they just throw the ark around sometimes and do things with it. Here the Philistines are like, okay, if this is really God, then here's how you need to deal with this, and then we'll find out if it's God or not. Verse 5, wherefore ye shall make images of your emerods and images of your mice that mar the land. Ye shall give glory unto the God of Israel. Peradventure he will lighten his hand from off you, and from off your gods, and from off your land. And then we get the same idea that we got in chapter 4. Wherefore then do ye harden your hearts, as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts? When he had wrought wonderfully among them, did they not let the people go, and they departed? So even though it's been a while since everything went down in Egypt, and it's been decades further, probably, since we get to Goliath in the story here, they've got this story so firmly entrenched, there's no way they just forgot about it before the fight with Goliath. And there's certainly no way they forgot about this. So they're going to remember very specifically what God did to them while his ark was in their cities. And so they get it on a cart and they send it away. And they send it back to Israel. So they're coming to this with some pre-installed knowledge. And for all their swagger and for all their boastfulness, they've also got a little bit, at least, a fear in the back of their minds of what this God can do to them. But again, they're so resolved and just set the fight that that's just what they're going to do. That's who they are. All right, so got an idea about Goliath, Philistines. Anything else anybody wants to add to the list? And we'll start on Israel.
Well, they certainly have their own gods. So, I mean, they have a lot of faith in their own gods, too.
Yeah.
But they believe in many,
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, Dagon. Something fishy about the fish guy. Just one of those great stories about the ark is when they have it there, like God knocks their got over a couple times.
Hands fall off.
Yeah, in one case cuts his hands off too with it. So Yes, things get pretty intense, but they do. They still have a faith in their own gods. And to be fair, some of the way Israel's reacted to them before also kind of boosts their confidence that they have a little bit. After all, Israel came in to that fight in chapter 4 super confident. And they've lost a fight since to Samuel in Israel. Pretty big fight where Israel pushes them back out of their territory and kind of drives them out. But still, they've got more than basic reason to be a little bit confident in this case. So Saul. So let's go back to 1 Samuel chapter 9. So in all their fights with the Philistines, even with the great battles that God gives them through, or the great victories that God gives them through Samuel, and how righteous and how good Samuel is, Samuel's sons are not good guys, not good people. Very much like Eli's sons were in that case. And so Israel says, we don't want to be under them, and we want a king anyways to go out and fight our battles, and to go out and take care of it for us. And as angry as Samuel gets, and rightfully so, as angry as God gets about it, something always irks me a little bit about Samuel's response. It's like, well, your kids are terrible. It's like, no wonder they're at least pushing back against you a little bit. But Israel comes to Samuel, demands this king, and again, rightfully and honestly, it makes Samuel and God angry, but they say, fine. Here's all the things this king's going to do to you. Here's all the things this king is going to make you do. They say, nope, we want to be like everybody else. We want to be like all the other nations. And that's what really gets God in that case, is that's where their heart's at. It's not Samuel's sons are giving an excuse for them wanting to just be like everybody else in the end. And so God says, all right. And picks a guy named Saul. Chapter 9, verse 1. Now there was a man of Benjamin, whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Becherah, the son of Apiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And which is the same term kind of used of Boaz before. So his family's, pretty good here. Verse 2, and he had a son whose name was Saul, a choice young man and a goodly, and there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upward, he was higher than any of the people. Right? So what do we know about Saul immediately? What can we put in column Saul?
Good look.
Good looking. Yep. Yep. Good looking. Tall, dark, and handsome, one after the other here. He's good looking, he's tall, comes from pretty good family background here.
Not so old.
Yeah.
So he's young.
Mm-hmm.
He's a Benjamite, which has its own baggage.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and that's what I think is kind of... There we go. From the tribe of Benjamin. All right, so to give like the basic rundown of the story we've heard before, right? Just to review it as we go into all this, because I think this is important for Saul. As we go into all of this. So he's from this tribe of Benjamin, and we get to it a little bit later on. He actually comes or lives in the town of Gibeah. And so this is the tribe that came within 600 guys being wiped out entirely. So the town he's from, Gibeah, was a place where this, and if you ever think the world is just shot to pieces and things have never been so bad, just read Judges. It's like,
I don't know how anybody can read the Bible.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's the worst it's ever been.
It's the worst it's ever been. Man, it gets worse.
It's bad.
It gets a lot worse. And the fact that, in one way we know it, is the story starts with a Levite, his priestly tribe, a Levite, and his concubine went to. And it's just all downhill from there. So this Levite and his concubine wander into Gibeah, where through a whole series of messed up events, she is attacked and murdered. And the guy takes the corpse, chops it up, and sends it all throughout Israel as this is how messed up this place is. And Israel for all of Israel's problems in Judges. Israel goes, that's pretty messed up. So they all get together and they decide to go after Benjamin. They go to Gibeah and they go to Benjamin and they say, give us these men in Gibeah that have caused this great offense, and we will kill them, and that'll be it. But Benjamin says, no, not going to do it. And so after Benjamin gets a victory or two, they get reduced to 600 people. And then Israel, after having almost wiped out a tribe, goes, we almost wiped out a tribe. Whoops. And realizes that they also don't have any wives for these guys. So they go to this place called Jabesh Gilead, kill pretty much all the men and anybody that was married, any woman that was married to them, and take all the ones that weren't and give them to the Benjamins, and still come up 200 people short, right? So then they go to this other town and they kidnap 200 more people. They tell the Benjamites, go, here's when they're going to show up, go. And it's 7 brides for 7 brothers. Exactly what happened.
How is that a good movie?
How is that? I got so many complaints.
So wrong.
So wrong. So many. I am totally justified in not liking that movie. Anyway, so Benjamin goes and they capture these women and take them back. And their tribe continues. And so Saul comes from all of this. And there's no way, the same thing with the Philistines, there's just no way, again, that this doesn't mess with your head a little bit. Either making you feel kind of lowly, possibly ashamed, because again, you're from the very city where this happened at, or very angry, even still, at how all this went down. But there's no way this doesn't affect you. And this is where one of those maybes comes in. It's one reason why I think Saul is possibly as low-key as he is in these early chapters, is Benjamin's just not really, like Saul's right when he says that, like Benjamin's just not much to think about, not much to think over. And so we get this guy named Saul, who's from this place, in this tribe, just the massive, most messed up background in Israel. And his father loses some donkeys. Saul goes with his servant to find them. The servant says, hey, why don't we go ask the seer, this man of God, about it. And let's see, verse 7. Let's read verse 7 of 1 Samuel 9. Then said Saul to his servant, but behold, if we go, what shall we bring the man? For the bread is spent in our vessels, and there is not a present to bring to the man of God. What have we? And so we kind of a respectful idea from here from Saul. And so they go, they meet it from Samuel, the donkey situation is resolved, and God points out to Samuel that this is the one he's anointed. And Samuel's, sees a tall, dark, and handsome dude, and says, you're the one that God's picked to be king. Chapter 10, verse 1. Then Samuel took a vial of oil and poured it upon his head and kissed him and said, is it not because the Lord hath anointed thee to be captain over his inheritance? When thou art departed from me today, then thou shalt find 2 men by Rachel's sepulchre in the border of Benjamin and Zelzah, and they will say unto thee, the asses which thou wentest to seek are found. And lo, thy father hath left the care of the asses and sorroweth for you, saying, what shall I do for my son? And then he gives them a whole bunch of signs, including this wild prophesying thing, that are going to confirm that God's picked him to be king. And it says in the course of this as well that you're going to become a different person. Samuel just tells him up front. And the Bible confirms that that's what happens along the way here, is that the Spirit of God comes upon him and changes him basically into another man. So Saul goes back home. They ask him, hey, where you been? What's going on? And Saul gives them the rundown, except, even after being asked, tell us what Samuel told you, except for that whole part about being king. He said, the donkeys are great. They're found. End of story, right? But then, Israel comes together here, and they're talking once again about this king that they want, verse 17 of chapter 10. And Samuel called the people together unto the Lord in Mizpah, and said unto the children of Israel, thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of all kingdoms, and of them that oppressed you. And ye have this day rejected your God, who himself saved you out of all your adversities and your tribulations, and ye have said unto him, nay, but set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your thousands. And so the tribe of Benjamin's taken, and then the family of Kish is taken, and they get right down to the guy who is nowhere to be found. Verse 22. Then they inquired of the Lord further if the man should yet come thither. And the Lord answered, Behold, he had hid himself among the stuff. And they ran and fetched him thence. And when he stood among the people, he was higher than any of the people from his shoulders and upward. And Samuel said to all the people, See him whom the Lord hath chosen, that there is none like him among all the people. And all the people shouted and said, God save the king. Then Samuel told the people the manner of the kingdom and wrote it in a book and laid it up before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, every man to his house. And Saul also went home to Gibeah, and there went with him a band of men whose hearts God had touched. But the children of Belial said, How shall this man save us? And they despised him and brought him no presents. But he held his peace. And Saul at this point is acting like a different guy from what he will eventually act like. So they narrow down this whole process and announce all this to the people, and then Saul's nowhere to be found, and God says, You got to go track him down because he went and hid. And again, this is where I want to give Saul a little bit of leeway here. He's been reluctant, at least about this whole thing, even with the signs that God has shown him. But to be fair, whenever Saul and Samuel and all the people are gathered together, Samuel starts out by reminding him how this is only happening because you rejected God. And you've made a terrible, horrible decision. And by the way, here's your king that you want.
It's going to be terrible. It's going to make your life miserable.
It's going to make your life miserable. There he is. So if I'm Saul, I'm probably spending some bit of time doing this myself and easing out of the picture. But what can we plug in for Saul here so far? So there's some history. Benjamin, the city that he comes from, has at least got a little bit of shyness in the beginning, or fear.
The Spirit's on him, though.
Spirit of God is with him. Yep. So he's got that in his camp at this point. And he's even been shown signs of all these things. Anything else about Saul that you would add?
Not fully supported.
Yeah. He's got this group that's like, well, you're not our king. We didn't vote for you. Not fully supported. But having the Spirit of God on him, he lets the slide go.
But before he gets to the next, like to the David and Goliath thing, there is an instant that says that they all supported him.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. They get around. They come around.
Yeah.
That's why it's good enough to be too rushed to judgment when people don't support you.
Uh-huh.
You never know what the future will bring.
Yeah, exactly. And in chapter 11, that future starts coming up of 1 Samuel here. So the town got almost wiped out before Jabesh Gilead, where all the guys got massacred, is again under pressure here and put under one of the weirdest surrender deals, covenants of all time. But the fact that they're in distress comes to Saul in verse 4. Chapter 11, Then came the messengers to Gibeah of Saul and told the tidings in the ears of the people, and all the people lifted up their voices and wept. Behold, Saul came after the herd out of the field, and Saul said, What aileth the people that they weep? And they told him the tidings of the men of Jabesh. So the Ammonites have surrounded the place, they're there, and they say, we'll make a condition, we'll make this covenant with you if we can punch out all your right eyes so we have something, to make fun of Israel for here. And Jabesh Gilead says, well, give us 7 days. The Ammonites say, all right, just weird. Which is a strange situation when you're in that position. They say, fine. Maybe they didn't think anybody would come help them because they had attacked them before. I don't know. Verse 6, And the Spirit of God came upon Saul, and he heard those tidings, and his anger was kindled greatly. So you get kind of what's going to happen with David here, and how David's going to get angered by certain situations and get roused up. You get the same thing with Saul in this case. The Spirit of God comes upon him, gets angry, and then he decides to repeat history. Verse 7, And he took a yoke of oxen and hewed them in pieces, and sent them throughout all the coast of Israel by the hands of messengers, saying, Whosoever cometh not forth after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done unto his oxen. And the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out with one consent. So they've got this whole messaging service where they cut things up and distribute it. And
It's a Gibeah thing.
It's a Gibeah thing. I don't know. It's a Gibeah thing, but so when we make fun of the post office too, at least, yeah, it could be, again, it could be worse. Yeah, yep. So they send out this message, and Saul isn't even announcing this message adds Samuel's name to it. So he boosts his street cred a little bit here. He's got these people that have already pushed back against him. He's out plowing the field. Like this is their king out plowing the field. So he's adding Samuel's name in. So Israel comes together. They save the town. And based on what had happened before with Benjamin, then it's pretty well likely that Saul is, of his descendants, or his ancestry is a mix of Benjamin here in this Jabesh Gilead town, or Gibeah and Jabesh Gilead, because that's all that was left. Or Shiloh, maybe. So, Israel has this great victory, and Samuel even, in verse 14 says, Then says Samuel to the people, Come and let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there. And this cracked me up with reading different sources, where they would be like, well, there's 3 different coronation stories for the Bible, for Saul in the Bible, and this is most likely the third one, or this is most likely the real one. And it's like, there can be one story here.
Yeah, it's a big country too.
Yeah.
Different places, different times, sure.
Yeah, different times, different
Their
places.
mouths. What's wrong with that?
That's right. And so things are happening. Things are happening progressively here, and it all fits together as one piece. And so in chapter 12, again, Samuel gives them history, and again still says, if you and your king disobey God, he's going to wipe you out. And he's going to deal with it. And so, again, everything with Saul is still couched in these terms. Verse 24 of 1 Samuel 12. Only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider how great things he hath done for you. But if ye shall still do wickedly, ye shall be consumed, both ye and your king. And this is where we'll kind of wrap up tonight, and we'll get into the rest of it next week. But so Saul has this one good period here. Samuel brings the people together. There's rejoicing. There's reminding of what their responsibilities are to God. And then the Philistines attack again in chapter 13. Jonathan, Saul's son, wins a great victory against the Philistines. But even in the midst of this great victory, some pretty bad things happen for Saul. So in verse 6 of chapter 13. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, the people were distressed, and the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. And he tarried 7 days, according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, Bring hither a burnt offering to me and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. And Samuel said, What hast thou done? And Saul said, Because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore said I, The Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself therefore, and offered a burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. And here we get David's first indirect cameo appearance. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart. And the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. And then Samuel continues on his way, and Saul numbers his people for the fight. So, he's got his great victory, but then not so great under pressure when this kind of second big test arises. Early on in his kingship. And goes to excuses and trying to reason his way out of obeying what Samuel and what God had told him. And the reaction is pretty harsh right off the bat. So because of this, the kingdom is going to be taken away. For now would he have established that kingdom forever. But now he's going to seek a man who's after his own heart and make him captain over the people. And it's pretty rough punishment after things had kind of been going all right. But you also get the idea here that God is very upfront setting the tone for this whole thing. He's like, you wanted a king, I told you what happened. I also told you what happened if you disobeyed me. And you disobeyed me, and so, boom, he's not playing around with this. And so not only is this a judgment on what Saul does and Saul's decisions, but it's also, I think, meant to be an example to the rest of the kings that are going to follow at this point, to walk in God's ways and listen very carefully and specifically to what he says when he says it, and do it exactly like he says. Only their track record in keeping that isn't so hot. So this happens to Saul, and then Saul, despite Jonathan's great victories here, Saul kind of loses his advantage with the people because he makes a vow that while the Philistines are on the run here, that no one can eat anything until I'm avenged on my enemies. A dumb vow, stupid vow. And it's just like a heat of the moment, I'm king, and this is the thing. And Jonathan, not hearing this, has eaten some honey. And so this comes to Saul's attention, and Saul, in his great fatherly way, instead of realizing that the vow was stupid and that God is probably not speaking to him when he asks because this whole situation is stupid, Saul says, all right, Jonathan, you gotta die. And I'm sorry, we've got to live out this vow. For chapter 14, in verse, where'd it go? 43. Chapter 14, verse 43. Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what thou hast done. And Jonathan told him and said, I did but taste a little honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand, and lo, I must die. And Saul answered, God do so and more also, for thou shalt surely die, Jonathan. And the people said unto Saul, shall Jonathan die, who hath wrought this great salvation in Israel? God forbid. As the Lord liveth, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground. For he hath wrought with God this day. So the people rescued Jonathan, that he died not. Then Saul went up from following the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. So within a very short amount of time, you get the guy who is king of Israel and had shown signs of God's blessing publicly and repeatedly slapped. Multiple back-to-back occasions. So, and there's, like, again, this is where it being real people comes into play here. Like, we think political gossip travels fast in our day. Like, when everything's going by mouth, like, there's no way that what had happened with Samuel isn't all over the place at this point. And now you've got the people saying, no, you're not going to do this thing you said you were going to do. And Saul says, okay, I won't do it, unless Jonathan lived. And so, as we approach the story of David and Goliath, and as we consider some other factors and go through a little bit more of Saul's history to start off next week, we can kind of, I think, keep some things in mind as we go into it. So not only is Saul, at the time we get there, in David and Goliath, have the Spirit of God, removed from him, it's been taken away from him, and giving in to all those fears and worries and doubts, and his state of mind being pretty iffy at the point. You've also just got a guy who can beat up, just as a king, and as a leader, and as a ruler. And when he has stepped out publicly, it has worked, and it has very much not worked. So if you don't have the Spirit of God helping you, and you're in a mode of indecision, you are going to sit there, and you are going to freak out, and have great pride about it. And then we'll consider some more about what's going on with these guys next week. So, any thoughts, additions?
We're leaving out, if we're gonna, Saul also, right after that, did have some victories.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yep, and we'll start next week off with that, actually.
Combined with a very big heavy.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get back to that. Yeah, we'll get back to that next week. Actually, we can read that one more verse real quick because I want to say one thing that goes with it. So Saul, in verse 47, so Saul took the kingdom over Israel and fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, and against the children of Ammon, and against Edom, and against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. And whithersoever he turned himself, he vexed them. Wherever he looked, he had great success. So even with this problem, God still blesses what he's doing as king. And he's living out his purpose here, which was supposed to be to, in this case, defend the people from their enemies and consolidate everything. But the thing I like about that is I was looking at secular sources about it, and one of them I read was recounting this whole thing and said, and the Bible account also says that Saul had great victories wherever he went, and that seems unlikely. I was like, Thanks, Encyclopedia, for your commentary and your insight into this situation at war. Yeah, it's like, I'm sure that's appreciated.
It's not like they had a tiny army. I mean, they
Right.
pulled together 300,000 people like nothing flat. I mean, they had
Yeah.
a massive army. So
Pulled
it was
together.
really huge people at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it just goes to show you it goes to show you the lengths people go to when they want to reject something to begin with. They're like, yeah, that sounds silly, but makes me wonder how much research they put into other things as well.
Always a question.
Always a question. All right, Mr. Webb, you want to close this out with prayer?
Hey, Father, we thank you for time to spend your word today. And, Lord, just remember these things.